Welcome. This is our day for kings, so I hope you all brought your crowns and are ready to dive into this very complicated group of documents. As we begin our time together, let's offer a prayer to God. We thank you, gracious God, for this new day, for the opportunity to come and study and learn and grow. And we pray you will help us to deepen our understanding and increase our faith and enlighten our hearts. Amen. So off we go. I am so grateful to Matt and Margaret for setting up this Older Testament study. It's so critical for us to understand something about what's going on in the Older Testament in order to understand the New. There are things in the New Testament that we absolutely miss if we don't have some understanding of what's going on in the Older Testament. All of this Hebrew Bible can be viewed through the lens of conquest and exile. We'll get to that in a little bit. There are pivotal events in Israel's history, the Exodus, which we've talked about before, and the exile, which will come today. We're covering 400 years of history here in 1 hour. I thought about how to figure how many years in a minute do we need to take care of, and my math is not, I couldn't even figure out what to divide into what, so I don't do math. So the Exodus, however it occurred, it was pivotal in shaping the identity of the nation. It was the story of deliverance, of liberation, and of the giving of the law, which shaped everything or impacted everything after that. And then the exile, which we'll get to today, was a great devastation. Everything was lost. And the people are wondering what happened and why, and how can we prevent it from happening again? So that's part of the lens that we look through as we read this material. And there are two pivotal characters that serve as role models or as models or archetypes for all this history. Moses, whom you know, we've talked about Moses before. We'll see him pop up again in Elijah. We'll see him pop up again in Jesus. We won't get all to that this time, but nevertheless, Moses is there. And David is the other one. David, of course, we've talked about in the past 2 weeks, who is not an icon of moral integrity. However, he is the standard of faithfulness to God, to Yahweh, against which every other king is measured. He did a lot of bad things, but he never wavered from his devotion to Yahweh. And that's a really important piece. Okay, now I get to click. It worked. Okay, here we go. At the beginning of Kings, David dies. And then Solomon is crowned king over the United Kingdom, his son Solomon from Bathsheba. And then Solomon dies and the kingdom splits. And we'll talk about these things in more detail, but just to give you an overview of the time frame. The kingdom splits into the north and the south, and I've got a map for that in a minute too. And then later on, Omri moves the capital, King Omri moves the capital of the northern kingdom to Samaria. It's often we'll read about Samaria as representing the northern kingdom. In the ancient Near East, it was very common to refer to the nation by the name of the capital. Nineveh, that's Assyria. Samaria is the northern kingdom of Israel. Judah, Jerusalem is this kingdom of Judah. In 871, these are all before the Common Era dates, of course. And the thing about this is we have to go backwards or in order to go forwards. It's so complicated. I don't do numbers to begin with. So, in which century is it? I don't ask me. I just don't do numbers. But there in 871, we have King Ahab and his wife Jezebel of great fame, and we'll talk about them in a bit too. The fall of Samaria, the Assyrians swoop in 722 and demolish the northern kingdom and deport all the people into other countries. And then they repopulate it with people from other conquered countries. Sennacherib of Assyria puts Jerusalem under siege, and we have Hezekiah's tunnel, and we'll talk about that. And those Assyrian kings, you know, you gotta love them. If you ever have a new pet and you're looking for a name, may I suggest Sennacherib? That's a good one. Tiglath-Pileser. They're just fun to say. Ashurbanipal. They're just fun to say. So those Assyrian kings, they're interesting. And Ashurbanipal was the last strong king of Assyria. And he dies, and then Josiah is king in Judah and institutes religious reforms. The Babylonians conquer Assyria in 612, the fall of Nineveh. And then the first Babylonian siege of Jerusalem. And a lot of the elite are deported into exile. And then finally in 586, this is where Kings wraps up. 586, Babylon destroys Jerusalem, demolishes the temple, and the people are taken into exile. There are few left to till the land, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, now we've got that slide. Now then, let's see. Kings introduces the prophetic role and provides a context for the prophets, which we will be studying in the weeks to come. I have timelines in books, and you can see some of that in the timeline that we have in our materials, that these kings are associated with various prophets as they come along. And so to understand those prophets, we need to understand what was going on that they were having so much trouble with. The text presupposes a practice of monolatry as part of our background. That's an important thing to understand, that monotheism was not fully developed in this period of history, not until after the exile, some will say. There may have been hints of it earlier on, but basically what the people practiced was monolatry, the worship of one God in the pantheon of gods. And each country, each nation had its own God, and you got to worship your own God in your own country. Not that there are not other gods, they're just not ours. So that concept of monolatry is an important one. Over and over, the expectation is expressed that Israel is to worship only Yahweh and only in Jerusalem. Only Yahweh, only in Jerusalem. Now then, we've got another one coming up here. Oh, whoops. Oh, here we go. Yeah, we're going to talk about maps. Just to give you a... Okay, here's my high tech. Are you ready for this? Here we go. Can I take this with me? Okay, we'll see how it goes. Oh, okay. Oh, life is so complicated for the technologically impaired. Just to give you a sense of what we're talking about, this is the Levant that Matt has talked about, this whole area. And these are some of the neighbors of Israel. And right along here is Jerusalem. And when the kingdom splits, it splits like this. And I've got a map of that too. But we've got Phoenicia up here. And Ahab marries a Phoenician princess, Jezebel. Aram and Damascus here. And Ammon and Moab. Do you remember where those names come from? Anybody want to shout it out? The sons of Lot, right? And the incestual relationships they had with their father because they thought the world had come to an end. Anyway, so we've got Moab and Ammon, and if you have negative readings about these two countries, it makes sense thinking about where they've come from, right? And Edom down here as well, and the Philistines down here. So we know about them. Okay, so we've talked about that. Maybe I'll click again, and we'll look at the map of the divided kingdom. After Solomon dies, the kingdom splits. This is pretty much about where it is. Here's Jericho. Here's Jerusalem in the south. And in the north, we've got, that should be Dan. Yeah, I think that's Dan. It's hard to see here. And here's Bethel. And so I'll talk about those in a minute, too. And here's Samaria. This would be the capital of the northern kingdom. Megiddo is another important place in the Jezreel area. So there you are, okay? Any questions about the map? Don't you wish you had one just like it? You can find it online in our materials. So, okay. All right, now let's try this again. So we've got our maps. Kings introduces that prophetic role, and then we have and here's another map. And that's the Assyrian Empire, as you can see, and Nineveh up there. And the Assyrians were incredible. At one point, this was at the pinnacle of their power, and they even controlled Egypt and all the way up north into what we call Asia Minor today. But, poor little Israel down here was just in the way. It was in the way of their empire. So no wonder it was demolished. Okay, so there's that. Now, biblical historiography. Let's talk about that a little bit. And how the Bible deals with history. Our modern understanding of history, and I would say our modern hope of history, is that it provides accounts of the past that are documented with facts, with historical figures and events. Sometimes history gets distorted. Maybe you've been reading some of the accounts about the assassination of John Kennedy, and maybe we didn't have all the facts, and so we never know for sure. But our modern understanding of what history should be is that it's documented on facts and real people and real events. Pre-modern history that we're talking about in Kings is a depiction of the past rather than an account. There's a real fine difference there, isn't there? A depiction of the past rather than an account. And so we look at that material through that lens as well. This biblical historiography is also a part of our understanding of this material. It displays historical consciousness. I think that's not going to work there. And represents an anthology of historical and mythological accounts of the past, poetry and prose. The texts were written much later than the events, usually. Most of this material was written or at least edited after the exile. So it comes much later than the events that happened. It uses the past to explain the present, etiologies. How did something come to be called something, and then looking at the past for that. To establish the legitimacy or illegitimacy of material that comes to us. And to encourage Yahweh to act now as Yahweh acted in the past. And a motive for compliance with divine law. So, and some of it is just to entertain, and we see a few of those things coming along too. So, next we have the Deuteronomic history. I don't remember if Matt and Margaret have referred to this, but I know that we've talked about it together, this Deuteronomic history that produced this material. We think of the Deuteronomic school like in Greece we had Aristotle had his school, and Plato had his school, and people who write in those forms and from those perspectives. And so what we're working with here is a Deuteronomic school. The origins of it probably came from the northern kingdom, starting in Israel, the northern kingdom. And we see it has a very particular point of view, and it's very harsh toward the northern kingdom. And then after 722, when Assyria destroyed the northern kingdom, it moved south to Judah. These folks moved south and lived in Judah and did some of the writing there. Evidence of an editorial hand in the Deuteronomic history is all over the place. The contents of the Deuteronomic history include Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings that we've been studying, and several prophets as well. The themes are obedience to the teaching of Moses, to the teaching of the law. That's a really important one. And the failure of the kings is always because they did not adhere to the teaching of Moses. The land of promise is contingent upon exclusive worship of Yahweh. And the centralized cult in Jerusalem temple is of primary importance. The Davidic covenant of eternal dynasty is a part of that those themes and that promise that David's history will go forth. And then we have, we got all these ideologies, isn't it fun? The royal ideology in the Near East. The ideal king is chosen and blessed by God's, is healthy, energetic, long-lived, able to produce heirs. That's a very important factor. The ideal king is prosperous and just. And sometimes we get 3 out of 4. The king's role is to secure the kingdom from all threats, foreign and domestic, establishes justice, especially for the poor, the oppressed, the widow, the orphan, and the alien in the land. The king's role ensures proper observance of the cult. It is primary contact between the God and the kingdom. And as the king goes, so goes the kingdom. If the king is faithful, the kingdom is faithful. And if not, the exact opposite. So it's important to consider what a king is like and what the king does, to consider the effect of the king's actions on the kingdom, and consider whether actions serve best interests of the kingdom. Sometimes yes, and sometimes definitely not. So we've got this ideology. Now then, an aside. What does it say? Another part of this is that the Davidic monarchy from David through Zedekiah, who is the last king of Judah, had considerable influence on the formation of the biblical tradition. From 400 years of monarchy, we draw this royal ideology and concepts that derive from and supported and shaped the monarchy through 4 centuries. The king is chosen by God. Remember, God chose Saul, God chose David, God chose. We don't quite get that when we come to Solomon. Definitely Nathan and Bathsheba conspire to get David to declare Solomon king, but nevertheless, there's a special relationship between the king and God, of mutual obligation between the deity and the monarch. And the relationship is often expressed in a metaphor of sonship, that you are my son. We have the royal psalm, Psalm 2, for David's inauguration, so to speak, You are my son, today I have begotten you, we read in the psalm. And even in Isaiah chapter 9, for a child has been born to us, a son given to us. This idea of king and son runs through all this material. This is the ideal king, the one that has this familial relationship with God. So now I have to ask myself, you may ask as well, what does it say about Jesus upon his baptism in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that we have a voice saying, this is my son, the beloved, this is my son. King of the Jews, that whole concept of kingship then flows over. What's going on here? And we'll see more of that in a little while. A critical part of this ideology is that the temple in Jerusalem was to be the only location for cultic practices. Kings reports that shrines, Asherah poles, and high places were set up in other locations and dedicated to other gods, which was contrary to Yahweh's instruction. The main purpose of royal ideology is religious and political centralization. Jerusalem was the only place acceptable for religious practice. I keep saying that over and over, and I will continue to say it again and again. Interesting that Solomon built his palace between the temple and the city where the people lived, consolidating power and making himself the conduit for that worship of Yahweh. Now then, let's see, we've got another one here. The history of the monarchy has 3 sections. 1 Kings 1 through 11 covers the united monarchy, the Golden Age. The first 2 chapters complete the history of David's reign and then describe the accession of Solomon as king. Then chapters 3 through 11 present a dazzling picture of Solomon's rule of the United Kingdom. It was the Golden Age. Solomon was rich, he was powerful, he was brilliant, he was wise and savvy, an incredible leader in that regard. In 1 Kings 12 through 2 Kings 17 deals with the schism of the United Kingdom and gives parallel accounts of the separate kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. 2 Kings 18 to 25 continues the history of Judah after the fall of the northern kingdom up to the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 before the Common Era and the exile of the people. Even before David dies, Adonijah, David's second oldest son, after Absalom, declares himself king. And meanwhile, Bathsheba and Nathan visit the dying David and work out the anointing of Solomon as his heir. Okay, now listen to this one. Solomon rides David's donkey, the donkey of the king, to the spring Gihon to be anointed by Zadok the priest. Does that sound familiar to you? Who rode a donkey? Yeah, we see these things coming up over and over again. When we read the New Testament, if we have some background in this Old Testament, we know this is not just a little ride for Jesus on Palm Sunday, but it has deep, impactful meaning. We read in Zechariah chapter 9, your king comes to you humble and riding on a donkey. And so it says a lot. Well, Solomon goes to the shrine at Gibeon to offer sacrifices. This is before there is a temple, and has a dream in which he asks God for an understanding mind to judge your people, to distinguish between good and bad. And God was pleased with this request. Because you did not ask for long life and for riches and the life of your enemies, I grant you a wise and discerning mind. And I also grant you what you did not ask for, both riches and glory all your life, the like of which no king has ever had. And I will further grant you long life, if you will walk in my ways and observe my laws and commandments as your father David did. So Solomon fulfilled David's dream of a house for Yahweh, building the temple. And it was very clear that the Holy of Holies in this temple was the location of Yahweh. And here's the picture of the real temple. You know, the photography in that era was amazing. And you can see all the way back in the center is the Holy of Holies with these two cherubim, they're called, but they're more like sphinxes, winged sphinxes. We could add that to Tiglath-Pileser. And here's a cutaway. We've got a cutaway, which I always love these things. Okay, we're going to have to go over here and look at this now. Get my pointer out. We have over here, this is a basin where the priests would wash themselves before going into the temple. Didn't kind of bled over, but it's where the sacrifices were burned. And these little things are little carts that would roll around for the cleansing of the animals to be sacrificed. And then go up the steps, and then on either side in this hallway are these candelabra and an incense altar and another table, golden table for the bread, the showbread that would be placed there every week by the priests. And then up more steps and really up into this area to the Holy of Holies. This is where it all happened. And only the priest went there, and only once a year. Do you remember in the story of the birth of John the Baptist, his father Zechariah was the priest of the day and went into the Holy of Holies and had that vision, etc., etc. So that's where it was. That's where it all took place. Now then, the Lord has chosen, David says, or rather Solomon, at the dedication of the temple, he declared, the Lord has chosen to abide in a thick cloud. Remember, through the Exodus. And now I have built for you a stately house, a place where you may dwell forever. This declaration becomes absolutely crucial when we learn that the temple is destroyed 400 years later. This is the home of God. This is where God physically dwells, in that Holy of Holies. And when the temple is destroyed, what happened to God? It's huge. God makes it clear that it is God who has consecrated this temple. My eyes and my heart shall ever be there. The great if is the condition for Yahweh's establishment of Israel and the throne, if you will keep my laws and my rules. But if you don't, if you and your descendants turn away from me and do not keep the commandments and laws which I have set before you, and go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will sweep Israel off the land which I gave them. I will reject the house which I have consecrated to my name, and Israel shall become a proverb and a byword among all peoples. And as for this house, once so exalted, everyone passing by it shall be appalled and shall hiss. When they ask, why did the Lord do thus to the land and to this house, they shall be told, it is because they forsook the Lord their God, who freed them from the land of Egypt, and they embraced other gods and worshipped them and served them. Therefore the Lord has brought all this calamity upon them. Hard stuff. The rest of these two books is a litany of one bad king after another. It's explaining what happened and why. Worshipping Baal and Ashtoreth, and even Solomon was taking foreign wives from other lands and setting up shrines to Baal and abusing his people with taxes and forced labor. Solomon's wealth increased through extensive trade with other kingdoms. Oh, I think I've got more slides of that temple. Let's look at it and see. Ooh, look at that. All that gold inlaid on the walls, and I mean, it's just huge. And back in that Holy of Holies. Okay, we'll get to this. Your favorite story, right? Some of these wives, I'm sure, were political alliances. His political and diplomatic skills were considerable, and his international business ventures were extensive. Well, the Queen of Sheba heard about this reputation of Solomon, how wise he was, how powerful he was, how wealthy he was. Solomon was a big whoop-de-doo. There's no question about that. And so she wanted to see for herself if this was the case, if Solomon was truly as wise and wealthy, and to test him with some hard questions. We don't have the questions, which is too bad. It would be fun to know. So she traveled to Jerusalem from what is now Yemen in the Arabian Peninsula to meet Israel's king. And this is from chapter 10. She arrived in Jerusalem with a very large retinue, with camels bearing spices, lots of gold and precious stones. He sure is needing some of that, we know. And this is what I have written from chapter 10. This is from the Jewish Study Bible. When she came to Solomon, she asked him all that she had in mind. Solomon had answers for all her questions. There was nothing that the king did not know. Woo! Nothing to which he could not give an answer. When the Queen of Sheba observed all of Solomon's wisdom and the palace he had built, the fare of his table, the seating of his courtiers, the service and attire of his attendants, and the wine service and the burnt offering that he offered at the house of the Lord, she was left breathless. Don't you love that? She was breathless. The NRSV says there was no more spirit in her. No, she was breathless. Well, the one thing leads to another when you have that kind of a response. And yeah, and so when she goes home, she takes some gold and silver and stuff with her, but also a little something, a little bun in the oven, as we used to say. I mean, this is part of the legend. You remember the name Haile Selassie? He was the last emperor of Ethiopia. Well, he was a member of the Solomonic dynasty, which claims to trace lineage to Emperor Menelik, believed to be the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Yeah, he was called a descendant of David and the Lion of Judah. So, there's a little credence to that legend. It's kind of just a little fun aside if you need conversation at your next cocktail party. Remember Haile Selassie? It's not nearly as much fun as Tiglath-Pileser, but there you go. Okay, now then, we've got trouble in paradise here, and people are not happy with what Solomon has been doing and how harsh his practices have been in enslaving people to build this temple and all the taxes required for building his palace and his temple. And I mean, it's costing a lot of money, and the people are paying for this. So it's not always copacetic, as my mother used to say. And Jeroboam was one who was not happy and was starting to rebel against Solomon. And then the prophet Ahijah encountered Jeroboam and tore his own robe into 12 pieces. And he told Jeroboam to take 10 pieces of this robe, take 10 pieces of cloth. And then the 10 tribes ceded due to Rehoboam's harsh practices, because when the kingdom split, Solomon died, and Rehoboam, his son, became king, and he was no better than his father and some of the other kings. He was very harsh. The older advisors were telling him, you need to follow the way of David, and the younger advisors were saying, no, you do whatever you want. So he did whatever he wanted, and he was harsh and not a good king. And so the kingdom split. And Jeroboam was worried that if people went to Jerusalem to make their sacrifices, that they'd kind of want to go back. Maybe they wanted to return home and, oh, Jerusalem, not so bad. So he made 2 new shrines for those sacrifices, one in Dan, one in Bethel, which we looked at before, in the top and the bottom of the northern kingdom. From this point on, king after king followed the ways of these 2 kings, abusing their power and allowing the worship of Baal and other gods. The political chaos that characterized this period puts these 2 kingdoms in a position of vassalage, mostly to Assyria. I was going to say something and it went away. It's too bad I didn't have a slide of it, whatever it was. Sometimes Judah itself had vassals, like Moab or Edom. What was that going to be? From this going to follow these 2 kings. Oh, well, doesn't matter. Well, 5 kings later, in Israel, Omri, who was another really bad king, did what was displeasing to the Lord. Oh, I know what it was. Over and over again, we read in these texts about the kings followed the ways of Jeroboam the first, Jeroboam son of Nebat, followed the ways of Jeroboam son of Nebat. So Jeroboam putting up all these other shrines. Omri did what was displeasing to the Lord, as did those before him, but he was worse than the others, and his son Ahab was worse than his father, walking in the ways of Jeroboam son of Nebat. Ahab married the Phoenician princess Jezebel, whose name has become synonymous with the evil woman. She was power-hungry and violent. Just ask Frankie Lane, right? I was thinking maybe I could play Jezebel for you, but I don't think we'll do that today. If ever the devil was born without a pair of horns, it was you, Jezebel. It was you. Boy, Frankie just went on and on. So that was Jezebel, and she has this reputation that's been attached to other evil women. I mean, sadly to say. Now then, another slide. Here we've got Ahab and Jezebel, and who's this on the right? Who does that look like? Pardon? A little bit like Jesus, right? Maybe John the Baptist, a little bit. But that's Elijah. Now then, Elijah is a very important figure in all of this. It's very important for the New Testament to think about Elijah. So Elijah the prophet comes along. He is a new Moses, and we'll see parallels with the life of Moses. And he parts the Jordan River with putting his cloak on it so people can cross over the Jordan. It's just interesting, all the different parallels with Moses. And you think about the transfiguration story with Jesus, and who was up there with him? Moses and Elijah, right? So there's a pattern going on here. And at the Passover Seder, there's always a chair left empty for Elijah, for when Elijah comes. So this is a very important figure. Elijah was very unhappy with Ahab and how disobedient he was and how evil. And he declared there would be no rain upon the land because of Ahab's apostasy. And so there's a drought. And he encounters a poor widow who is about to use her last bit of oil and meal to make a little cake for herself and her son before they die. And Elijah comes along and arranges for the jars of oil and the meal never to run out. So every time something is taken, it is replenished. And we think about, Jesus, those 5 fish and 2 loaves, or 2 loaves, 5 loaves and 2 fish. Elijah. It's over and over again. Later, the woman's son dies, and she calls Elijah, and Elijah lays upon the child 3 times, and he comes back to life. So we've got healings in Elijah's story. We've got resurrection in Elijah's story. Meanwhile, Jezebel has been killing the prophets of the Lord. And Elijah sends a challenge to the prophets of Baal to meet him on Mount Carmel, which is in the western part of Israel, to see whose God is stronger. Now, the first time that Tim and I took a group to Israel, we went to Mount Carmel, and the wind was so bad that we almost fell over. So we didn't go back there. But, maybe God's Spirit is still stirring on that mountain to whip something up. So we've got this plan coming, 450 prophets of Baal, and who is a storm god, and 400 prophets of his consort Asherah, and they prepare a sacrifice and call Baal to set it on fire. And there was no voice and no answer, no response. Oh, okay, now I brought a little program here from the oratorio Elijah. If you're familiar with it, I bet you've sung it, haven't you, Ruth? Yeah. I must have too, because I have this line in my head. Give an answer, Baal, give an answer, Baal. And it goes on and on and on, but nothing happens. Nothing happens. And so it's pretty awful stuff for those prophets, and they even start slashing themselves to the point of bleeding to coax the God to come and light the fire of this sacrifice. But it doesn't go well. And then it's Elijah's turn. And Elijah puts the wood together and the stones together, and then digs a trench around the little altar sacrifice, and they fill it with water, and then they pour water over the altar. They pour water everywhere, water, water, water. And then Elijah calls for God, and whoosh, there it is. The fire comes, and the sacrifice is made. So whose God is more powerful? This is another wonderful thing you could go. YouTube is a wonderful tool when you can get into it. So I would kind of just clue in some of these arias and so forth and choruses, and it was wonderful to listen to that. It's just beautiful. So I recommend it. Okay, so the Lord's fire came down and it consumed the burnt offering. And Elijah told the people to seize the prophets of Baal, and Elijah killed them all. Now remember, this is legend, not our understanding of history. It's a depiction of history, not always fact. And when Jezebel hears about this, all her prophets being slaughtered by Elijah, you can imagine she was not a happy camper. And she threatens Elijah's life, and he flees south, eventually to the Mount Horeb, which is synonymous with Sinai. Okay, what have we got here? Another parallel with Moses. He was told to go out and stand on the mountain, for the Lord is about to pass by. Remember in that Exodus story when Moses is up on the mountain and the Lord's going to pass by, but he could only see the backside of God lest he die. So here we've got another parallel with Moses. For the Lord is about to pass by. And there was a great wind and an earthquake and a fire, which we might have expected of Baal, the storm god. But the Lord was not in any of these. After the fire, there was a sound of sheer silence. Nothing. When I was in seminary, one of my classmates had been in California when that earthquake happened. Was it 91 or somewhere in there? And that she described that moment like this: sheer silence. Everything stopped. And then the Lord spoke to Elijah, and he said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he sent him off to crown another king and to find a king for Aram in Damascus area, and gave him work to do, and so off he went. Now then, there were more conflicts between Ahab and Elijah. And Jezebel would come to Ahab's rescue when he wanted to buy a vineyard that belonged to Naboth. Well, Naboth didn't want to sell his inherited land, and Ahab was not happy with that. And so Jezebel conspired to have Naboth falsely accused and done away with so that Ahab could have the vineyard that he wanted. He wanted to plant a garden there. I read an article just a couple of weeks ago about marriages in the Bible, and there were two marriages that one was good and one was bad. And the good marriage was Ahab and Jezebel because they worked together and supported each other. They were a team. And the bad marriage was Yahweh and the people because they separated and they did not honor. The people did not honor God. They were not devoted to God. Interesting. Okay, in the meantime, Elijah took on Elisha as his successor. These were probably originally two different stories that were edited into one. And Assyria continued to expand its power, and Israel in the northern kingdom was doomed because it stood in the way of Assyria's imperial ambitions. Their conquest of Israel was politically inevitable. But from the religious perspective of Amos and Hosea and the Deuteronomic historians, Israel was doomed because it had failed to live up to its covenant obligations with Yahweh. And in 722, before the Common Era, Samaria was conquered, its people were deported, and other foreign peoples were brought in to repopulate the land. Now, here's another little parallel. Remember the Samaritans in the New Testament? And they were not well thought of, right? They were not the friends. And because they come from this people that were not pure, shall we say. They were not true Israelites. They were foreign peoples who had been planted in the land. Now, they were having a little trouble getting along, and so the Assyrian king brought a priest in from wherever he had been sent to teach them how to worship Yahweh so they wouldn't have so much trouble. Okay, now let's see what's next here. Now, maybe. Okay. In 701, the Assyrian king Sennacherib, there's another one, Sennacherib, laid siege to Jerusalem. Hezekiah was the king, and he was considered a faithful king because he obeyed God and he got rid of a lot of the high places and the Asherah poles and all that sort of thing. And he built a tunnel from the spring Gihon to the pool of Siloam to secure the city's water source. He decided to stop paying tribute to Assyria, which didn't turn out so well, and he finally relented and at least kept Jerusalem secure in accordance with the ideal king. So we've got Hezekiah's tunnel. Well, you can see there, spring Gihon in the top and then down to the pool of Siloam. So kind of outside the city to the inside of the city to protect the water source. Now, another thing about that spring Gihon, there's a shaft that goes up from the spring to a well in the city, and that's where David crawled up in order to take the city from the Jebusites. And maybe you read that in some of the Samuel materials. So anyway, and here is Hezekiah's tunnel. You can go in there today if you would really like to do that. Wear old shoes. And, there we go. And there's an inscription that was planted there or placed there by Hezekiah or the people around him about the creation of this tunnel. And some started up at Spring Gihon. Some of the workers started at Spring Gihon, and some of the workers started down at the pool of Siloam. And then they started working toward each other. And it got to the point where they could hear each other on either side, and then they broke through to create the tunnel. And you can still see the little chips in the stone where they dug their way through this, creating this tunnel. Isn't that an interesting thing? I just love that story.
Roughly how long is that tunnel?
I don't know. It depends on how good your shoes are, I'm sure. I don't know how long it is, but I have no idea. That
The whole thing?
no, I haven't walked it. I have to admit, I would love to, but you could Google it. Say, how long was Hezekiah's tunnel? Give it a try. Maybe it'll work. Yeah. So and you kind of see a little bit what that's like. Okay. Now then, it's about time to wrap up here. And in 597, first of all, the 701, Sennacherib comes in, and we've got the tunnel. And then in 612, the Assyrian power waned after the death of Ashurbanipal, and Nineveh fell to the Babylonians. And 597, the Babylonians laid siege to Jerusalem. They didn't destroy the temple, but took many of the elite off into exile. And in 586, the Babylonians came again and demolished the temple and all Jerusalem. Most of the people were taken into exile, except for a few who were left to till the land. This became a province of Babylon. And in order for a province to be useful, the land had to be cared for. If it lies fallow, that's not a good thing. The locusts come and they eat everything up, and then they lay their eggs, and then they keep coming back and coming back. So they left some people in the land to till it and to make sure it stayed healthy. In 586, everything was gone. Remember the Holy of Holies in the temple? This was the physical location of God. And when that was gone, where was God? The people of Judah lost their land, lost all their social structures, lost their identity as a nation, and by implication, they lost God. No wonder this was such a catastrophic event. In the next weeks, we'll hear from the prophets about why they think that happened, about what happened and why. And how we move from this 400-year period before the Common Era to the 21st century of the Common Era is not an easy task. What do we do with this material? What do we take away from this volatile and violent history that can inform our lives today? For one thing, of course, there is that informing us about the Newer Testament, the life of Jesus, and some of the allusions there that are helpful for us to know. In these texts, we hold various concepts in tension between the sovereignty of God and free will, between God's promise of land and the reality of human failure, between God's punishment of the consequences of human behavior, and those are hard things. I encourage you to watch the video with Joe Scribner, and he addresses some of these, and that was very helpful for me. God continues to work in and through the complicated cultures and flawed humans of our time. In the weeks to come, we'll see God through the prophets calling the people to account for not abiding by the requirements of God's law and not caring for the widow, the orphan, and the poor, and the alien in the land. But we'll also see God's anguish and God's compassion and God's heartfelt disappointment in the people for their disobedience and their rebellion. I think there are at least 3 takeaways that we can come to in 1 minute here. First of all is an invitation to consider the criteria we use to select and evaluate leaders in our own time. They probably won't be the same as the ideal king. We live in a different time and a different circumstance. But to evaluate what are the criteria that we expect from our leaders, whether it's a new senior pastor or a political leader or a corporate leader, what do we expect from our leaders? What are the criteria for selecting a leader in our own time? Also, a reminder that God is a God of history, engaged in real life and caring and working in ways that we may never see. God's story is about flawed people whom God uses, and we are a part of that story. Whatever our weaknesses, whatever our flaws, whatever our mistakes or shortcomings, God can use us too. So now, with all that 400 years worth of stuff, any questions? Ken, yeah.
Got it.
We've got Ken and Shirley back there.
Hello, I'm Sheila. I'm caught by what you said at the end. What does this help us with today? I was struck by how the royal ideology reminded me of something called white Christian nationalism, which is something that if you all aren't understanding of it, you should be. And I also add to it, I went with my 5-year-old grandchild to the movie The Never Ending Story at a theater, which I don't know if any of you remember it. It was a movie, a children's movie. And one of the wise ones in this movie said, those with diminished hope can be controlled, which is and serves power. And I just think of that as relevant to today. And even this, I hear it in the story that you shared with us so well,
Right.
Kathy.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah. That's a very powerful statement. And so much of this is about power, isn't it? It's about power. Yeah.
Was it Ken? You had a
Yeah.
question? Here you go.
I was interested in how you would compare David and Solomon. So they both had good and bad sides, and we always look back to David as, the model.
Right.
And yet, you talk very highly about some of the things Solomon did.
I think that the most obvious is that David never wavered from his devotion to Yahweh. And Solomon didn't stay with that. Yeah, he had all those wives with all those different gods and allowed shrines and altars to be set up for them and so forth, yeah.
I have a question about the geographically specific nature of worship at the time. Why it was so important that there was only one place where Yahweh could be worshipped. Was it the need to really tie together the king with Yahweh? And if they're inseparable, it creates obviously problems in terms of expansion and the further away that you get. These are
Right.
small kingdoms at this time,
Yeah.
but over time, that just seems like eventually that was going to be a terrible
Right.
problem.
Well, it is a centralization of power. Absolutely, exactly. I mean, it's control. Yeah. Before we close today, I want to give a shout out to Nicole.
One more question?
Oh, one more question. Oh, good. Mustafa, let's hear it.
Yes, I just have here the genealogy of Abraham, and he looked like he was following the offspring of Ismael, and it looks like the Bible is silence about what happened of his progeny.
There is an understanding that the people of Edom came from Esau. So there's a little bit of that. But yeah, in the Kings, we don't get any of that. Don't get any of it. I'll give you, we're done. We're done. I can't give it to you. But nevertheless, my shout out to Nicole for purchasing a new lectern here for the vertically challenged. And my undying thanks for her for that. It makes a huge difference. And also to Michael Gold, who helped me prepare my slides. So thanks to those folks. And thanks to all of you for being here today, for your kind attention. And hopefully we'll get together again next week. And we'll be looking at Isaiah and see what Isaiah has to say about some of this stuff going on. So we'll see you next week. Thanks. And don't forget to buy lots at the fair.